What would you do if you were falsely accused of a crime and the system itself was stacked against you? What if the people meant to protect justice were the very ones breaking it? Elena Santos found herself caught in a web of lies, but what she uncovered in the courtroom would shock everyone. How far would you go to expose the truth? Like and subscribe for more incredible stories. Elena Santos stepped off the plane, the warm Miami air greeting her as she made her way through the terminal. As a criminal justice reform expert from Washington, D.C., she had been invited to speak at the University of Miami on the pressing need for reform within the legal system. Elena had spent years advocating for fairness, transparency, and accountability, tirelessly pushing to ensure that the justice system worked for everyone, especially the marginalized. Her reputation as a fierce and articulate advocate had earned her a place in many important conversations, and today was no different. The night before, she had dined with professors, law students, and activists, each eager to hear her thoughts on how the system could be reformed. Elena felt empowered as she spoke, her words resonating with the crowd, offering solutions and challenges in equal measure. As the dinner wound down, Elena decided to take a walk along the bustling streets of Miami's Little Havana district to clear her mind. The sound of laughter and music filled the air as she made her way down the colorful street, enjoying the sights and sounds of the neighborhood. It wasn't long before she ran into a familiar face. An older couple whom she had met earlier at the conference waved her over. The couple, deeply concerned about the injustices they had witnessed over the years, struck up a conversation about the deeply flawed legal system. The husband, a retired judge, spoke of the corruption he'd witnessed during his career, while his wife, a former lawyer, lamented the lack of accountability for those who perpetuated injustice. Elena listened intently, her mind racing as they shared their stories. The conversation quickly turned to solutions. "Elena," the wife said, her voice full of hope, "we need someone like you, someone with the strength and determination to push for change." Elena smiled, feeling the weight of their words. It was moments like this that reminded her why she fought so hard to bring about real change. Elena Santos walked briskly toward her rental car after a lively dinner in Little Havana. The night air was cool, filled with the sounds of the neighborhood's vibrant life. Her conversation with the professors and students had been invigorating, discussing ways to reform the justice system. As Elena neared her car, she was lost in thought, reflecting on the changes she hoped to see in the world. But just as she reached her vehicle, the screeching sound of tires tore through the night. A patrol car sped toward her, screeching to a halt just inches away. Elena froze, her instincts kicking in. 3 officers swiftly stepped out of the vehicle, moving toward her with purpose. "Hands where I can see them," the lead officer barked. His tone was cold, unyielding. Elena's heart rate quickened, and she instinctively raised her hands, her pulse pounding in her ears. Officer Carlos Rivera, a tall man with a hardened face, stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, filled with a sense of authority. "We need to search your vehicle," he announced, as if he had already made up his mind. Elena felt the tension in the air but managed to keep her voice steady. "What's this about?" she asked calmly, trying to make sense of the situation. She hadn't done anything wrong. Without responding, Rivera signaled to the 2 younger officers, who began rifling through her car. The entire interaction felt wrong, but Elena knew there was little she could do without escalating things. Minutes later, Officer Miller held up a small plastic bag containing white powder. "What do we have here?" Rivera asked, a smug grin crossing his face. "That's not mine," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the shock and anger rising within her. "You know that's not mine." Rivera didn't flinch. He turned to Miller, "What do you think, Miller? Think she's telling the truth?" Miller grinned back. "Not a chance," he said. "She looks guilty to me." Without warning, Miller slapped handcuffs around Alina's wrists. She felt the cold metal bite into her skin, but she remained calm. She knew she couldn't fight back physically, but she wasn't about to let them control the narrative. As they pushed her toward the patrol car, Alina noticed the growing crowd. Some passers-by had stopped to watch, pulling out their phones. One woman tried to intervene, holding her phone up to record the incident. "Back up, ma'am," Rivera snapped, his voice low but dangerous. "Unless you want to join her." The woman hesitated but quickly backed off, fear evident on her face. Alina couldn't blame her. She knew all too well how these officers operated. The situation was quickly spiraling, but she kept her composure, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her panic. Once inside the patrol car, Alina sat quietly, her mind racing. She knew the officers had the power to turn off their body cams, alter evidence, and make her case disappear. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a setup. But Alina wasn't going to give in. This fight was just beginning. The Miami courtroom was packed with a mix of reporters, law students, and spectators, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. Alina stood before the judge, Howard Miller, trying to maintain her composure. The stakes had never been higher. Her entire life felt as though it was hanging by a thread. At the prosecution's table sat Victor Sanchez, his confident demeanor making it clear that he believed victory was already in his grasp. Beside him were the officers, Carlos Rivera, Miller, and Denton, looking equally assured that their lies would be believed. Alina's public defender, Jack Sullivan, sat beside her, flipping through his notes with little urgency. His eyes rarely left the pages in front of him, and Alina could sense that he wasn't fully engaged in the weight of her case. It stung. She had hoped for a lawyer who would fight for her, not just go through the motions. But here they were, and it felt like the system had already condemned her. The trial began with Sanchez standing up to address the jury. His voice was smooth, confident, and dismissive of Alina's innocence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence is overwhelming," he began, his eyes never leaving Alina. The defendant, Alina Santos, was caught red-handed during a lawful stop by Miami police officers. Drugs were found in her vehicle, and we have the evidence to prove it. Sanchez's words were carefully chosen to sound undeniable. The room fell silent as Officer Denton took the stand. He was a large, broad-shouldered man who spoke with practiced ease, recounting how he and his colleagues had spotted Alina acting suspiciously near a restaurant. He explained that, based on her actions, they decided to stop her car. "We conducted a lawful search," Denton continued, his voice steady. "During the search, we found a small bag containing a white substance, which later tested positive for cocaine." The murmurs in the courtroom were quiet but significant. Alina could feel the eyes of the jury on her. Sanchez turned to them, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said, then turned back to Denton for a few more confirming details. Denton's calm demeanor made the whole scenario feel like a rehearsed performance, and Alina knew that the truth was nowhere in sight. When Officer Miller took the stand, Alina's frustration deepened. His testimony mirrored Denton's, adding nothing new except to further solidify their story. Then came Carlos Rivera, the officer who had arrested her. His smug, authoritative tone echoed through the courtroom as he declared that all procedures had been followed correctly. "We followed protocol," Rivera said, his voice smooth with confidence. "There were no shortcuts. Everything was done by the book." Alina's stomach turned. The lies were building up, and her frustration grew with every word. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, and she began to feel the weight of the unjust system closing in around her. The officers had rehearsed their stories so well that it was almost impossible to challenge them without solid evidence. And her public defender, who should have been her strongest advocate, remained silent. Her gaze shifted to Sullivan, who hadn't made a single objection, not even a word of defense. Her heart sank. This wasn't the fight she had envisioned. This wasn't the legal battle for justice. This was something else entirely, something rigged from the start. She had expected Sullivan to challenge the fabricated evidence, to at least put up some kind of resistance, but he didn't. As the officers finished their testimony, the weight of the trial pressed harder on Alina. The room felt suffocating. She had dedicated her life to exposing the truth, to fighting for the wronged and the oppressed, and now, here she was caught in a system designed to keep her down. She fought the urge to let her frustration show, but the reality was clear. The game was rigged. The jury, the judge, the prosecutor, the officers, they all seemed to believe in the same narrative. But Alina wasn't going to give up. This was only the beginning. Despite the overwhelming odds, she was determined to fight for her innocence, no matter how impossible it seemed. Alina sat at the defense table, her eyes focused on the jury as they listened intently to the officers' testimony. Each of them spoke with practiced ease, their rehearsed words reinforcing a false narrative that seemed to be winning. Victor Sanchez, the prosecutor, had delivered his case with precision, and the officers, Carlos Rivera, Miller, and Denton, were confident that the trial was as good as over. The weight of the situation pressed down on Alina. She could feel the injustice building around her, knowing how badly the system was rigged against her. But then, something shifted. Without warning, Alina stood up from the defense table. The room went quiet as she spoke calmly but firmly. "Your Honor, before we continue, I believe there's something you need to know." Alina's voice cut through the tension, steady and unwavering. "I am Alina Santos, and I am the FBI director." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Carlos Rivera, Miller, and Denton froze, their confident expressions now replaced by confusion and shock. Sanchez, who had been leading the charge, faltered for a moment, his self-assured smile slipping away. The room buzzed with disbelief as Alina revealed her true identity, and the officers seemed to understand in that instant that they had made a fatal mistake. Alina didn't wait for the chaos to unfold. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her FBI badge, flashing it toward the judge and the jury. The room gasped as they saw the emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the very agency the officers had unknowingly crossed. "I am Alina Santos, director of the FBI," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "And you, Officers Rivera, Miller, and Denton, have just wrongfully arrested a high-ranking official." A stunned silence followed. The officers sat frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. The realization had hit them hard. They had framed an FBI director. The weight of their actions was starting to sink in, and the realization of the consequences began to unfold in their minds. Alina stepped forward, holding the room's attention as she continued. "I have gathered evidence, recordings that expose your lies and corruption." She reached into her bag and played the audio from the hidden recorder she had been carrying. The voices of the officers filled the room. "Yeah, we've done this before," Carlos Rivera's voice came through loud and clear. "It's always the same thing, another innocent person to convict. This is how we make the system work for us." The courtroom erupted in shock. Gasps of disbelief filled the air as the officers' voices continued, admitting to framing Alina and mocking the justice system. Miller's voice joined in. "It's easy. Just plant the drugs and let the system do the rest. We'll have her out of the picture before she even knows what happened." The officers looked as if they had been struck by a lightning bolt. Carlos Rivera's face turned pale, and Miller and Denton exchanged panicked glances. Alina's words, combined with the damning evidence, left them no way out. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it now. As the sound of the officer's confession echoed through the room, Alina stood tall, the weight of the moment not lost on her. The jury, the judge, and even the prosecutor could no longer deny the truth. Alina had turned the tide in a single moment, exposing the corruption and lies of those who had conspired against her. The courtroom was buzzing with disbelief, whispers filling the air. The reporters at the back scrambled to capture the moment while the officers sat in stunned silence. Sanchez, realizing the magnitude of the situation, stood frozen. He had been part of this system, and now it was crumbling around him. Alina had done more than defend herself. She had exposed the very heart of the corruption that had long plagued the system. Alina looked directly at the officers as the weight of their actions sank in. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly, her eyes unwavering. "I won't stop here." The courtroom fell silent once more as Alina's words hung in the air, the fight for justice far from over. The courtroom was filled with a stunned silence as the federal agents moved in, swiftly placing Carlos Rivera, Miller, and Denton under arrest. The officers, who moments before had exuded confidence, were now reduced to helpless figures, their wrists shackled. The sound of handcuffs clicking echoed through the room, breaking the stillness. A ripple of disbelief ran through the crowd as the officers, once so sure of their victory, were escorted out of the courtroom in shame. Whispers filled the air, and reporters rushed to capture the historic moment. Alina stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she watched the men who had wronged her now powerless. For Alina, this was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Turning to Victor Sanchez, the prosecutor who had spent the trial trying to secure her conviction, Alina's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "You knew about this," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "You knew these officers were corrupt, and yet you chose to turn a blind eye and prosecute me with falsified evidence." Sanchez faltered, his face paling as the weight of Alina's accusation hit him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by the cold realization that he too had been part of this corrupt system. Alina didn't pause. Her eyes then turned to Judge Howard Miller, who had presided over the case with apparent indifference. "And you, Judge Miller," she continued, her voice rising in authority. "You allowed this to happen in your courtroom. You signed off on false convictions. You enabled a system that punishes the innocent while rewarding the guilty." Judge Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing as Alina's words hit home. Alina's gaze remained fixed on him as she addressed the entire room. "This corruption runs deep, and it doesn't end with these officers. I'm calling for a full investigation into your actions, into every person who has contributed to this broken system." The room grew still. The officers had been arrested, but Alina knew the fight for justice was far from over. She had exposed the corruption at its core, but now she needed to ensure it was rooted out entirely. She wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up for every person who had been wronged by a system that allowed the guilty to walk free. "The investigation doesn't stop here," Alina said firmly, her voice filled with resolve. "We will uncover every person who has protected this system of injustice, from the police officers to the prosecutors, to the judges who enable them. No one is above the law." As her words hung in the air, Alina turned toward the reporters, who were capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Her fight had just begun, but she had made one thing clear: the truth had come to light, and justice would not be silenced. Alina stood at the front of the courtroom, no longer just a defendant but a leader, determined to hold the entire corrupt system accountable. The officers, the prosecutor, and the judge may have thought they had the upper hand, but Alina had turned the tables, exposing the rot at the heart of the system. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle, a battle for justice, for accountability, and for a future where corruption could no longer thrive. Alina's victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was a testament to the power of truth in the face of overwhelming corruption. Against all odds, she had exposed the deep-rooted flaws in the justice system, proving that no one, not even those in positions of power, could escape the law when the truth was revealed. The officers who had thought they could frame her, the prosecutor who had played along, and the judge who had turned a blind eye, all were now facing the consequences of their actions. Alina had won, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. Her victory also served as a powerful lesson in courage. It reminded everyone in the room, and beyond, that standing up for what's right is never easy, especially when it feels like the system is against you. But Alina's unwavering resolve showed that change is possible when individuals find the courage to challenge systemic corruption. Her story is proof that the fight for justice is constant, and that real change only happens when people refuse to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. As the courtroom settled, Alina turned to address the crowd. "This victory is not just mine. It's for all those who have been silenced by corruption," she said, her voice strong. "We cannot allow the guilty to go unpunished simply because they hold power. We must stand up for the innocent, demand accountability, and refuse to let silence protect the guilty." Her words were a call to action. The fight for justice doesn't end with one victory. It continues in every step we take toward a fairer, more transparent system. Alina had shown them all that standing up makes a difference. And now, it was time for everyone to join the fight.